Hey everybody, this is presentation number 3 on Down and Out in Paris and London for POS 499, George Orwell and 20th Century Political Life, a senior seminar taught in the Political Science Department at the University of Maine. And I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So we step out of order chronologically a little bit this week in that Down and Out in Paris and London is George Orwell's first full-length publication. He had had some articles and shorter pieces published at this point, but he hadn't yet published a full book. So we read Burmese Days initially, as I said, because it really relates to this formative initial period in Orwell's adult life. And now we're going back in time and we're reading Down and Out in Paris and London, which is actually the earlier work. So in today's presentation, we'll provide a brief introduction to Down and Out in Paris and London, the general issues that the book is confronting and the context in which it resides. We'll talk about Orwell's motivations and his method. So why did he want to write about, the plight of the underclass in Paris and London? What was driving him to write about this issue? And how did he go about it? Which, as you'll see, is kind of unconventional. He did immersion, basically, lived amongst the people who were living in rooming houses and living on the streets. And then lastly, we'll talk about the dual questions of why this is important to understanding Orwell as a writer and a political figure, and lastly, why it's important to understanding 20th century political life. So, Down and Out in Paris and London, as I said, it's his first full-length text, and it's one which was a source of considerable struggle for Orwell, not only in the research phase of its writing, which was difficult because Orwell had placed himself in a condition of poverty, but also in the stage of actually writing the text and attempting to get it published. He wrote the book, the whole of the book, 5 separate times. There are 5 different incarnations, 5 different versions of Down and Out in Paris and London. The one that you read is the final version, but he ruminated over this and tried to rework the text several times. He was kind of finding his place as a writer, and he was still trying to flesh out, how he wanted to convey this narrative. So he goes through 5 different full drafts of this text, and it takes him 3 years. Orwell later in life would be known for, writing very quickly and kind of losing himself in a work. And 1984 was given, the scope of what's going on there, was written very quickly. But Down and Out in Paris and London takes him some time. And it was rejected numerous times. It was rejected by 3 separate publishers. The story about Down and Out in Paris and London that I really love, he basically reached a point where he had given up on the book ever getting published. He was probably kind of doubting his abilities as a writer and doubting whether he would ever become a published author. And he had a friend, Mabel Fears. The Fearses, they were this London couple. They were a little bit older than Orwell. They were kind of middle-aged. He was fairly young. And he would periodically live with them, and apparently he came in after the 3rd rejection. He threw down the manuscript in front of Mabel and basically told her to burn it, right? Burn this, it's never going to be published, but save the paper clips, right? So Orwell thought that the writing was worthless, but those paper clips, you can use them again. So she picks it up and she starts to look through it, and she thinks it's quite good, and she thinks that Orwell's telling a narrative that kind of needs to be told. And so she passes it on to a literary agent who's a friend of hers, who then passes it on to a guy named Victor Gallant. And he agrees to publish it, and he changes the name. It was originally called Days in Paris and London, which was a pretty bland title. But Orwell, finally is published. He has his work published. And it would subsequently go through, many different reprints. When Orwell achieved more literary fame with his later work, Down and Out in Paris and London, was kind of rediscovered. Right? So this documents his experiences in late 1927 to early 1929. He's living in Paris and London, and he's doing so on virtually no money. And you have to be careful not to read this as an autobiographical text. It's drawn on his experiences, but Orwell is definitely selectively presenting experiences here. And it's probably a little bit of an exaggeration. And there were certainly times where he broke his pattern of basically living on the street or living in rooming houses to stay with friends or to return to his parents' house in Southwold and kind of get out of that that environment for a little bit to kind of take a step back, and then he would go out and face it again. Basically, Down and Out is a pretty vivid and raw account of what it's like to live in conditions of extreme poverty, and Orwell was mimicking that experience as best as he could, with these periodic breaks to get a bath and to get a decent meal. A few things to note here. The first is that at the time Orwell is writing, there are very few state welfare programs in place to protect those who are in conditions of extreme poverty. So things that we think of today in Europe or the United States, other advanced countries, things like universal health care, social security, those sorts of protections, those sorts of government programs that protect people from conditions of extreme poverty were only in their very early stages. There was, in Britain at least, a rudimentary form of unemployment insurance that had been in place since 1911. But the issue with that is it was only paid to people who had recently become unemployed. So long-term unemployed individuals, or if you were simply in a condition of poverty, you didn't receive any benefits in Britain. And that was the case until after World War II. That was the case in Britain until the mid-1940s. In France, that was the case until almost 1960. So this is a picture of what extreme poverty looks like if there's no unemployment insurance, no disability insurance, none of those food stamps, welfare, those sorts of programs that protect people, give them at least a little bit of a cushion in conditions of extreme poverty. Second, and related, as a result, individuals who were in poverty were in a more advanced state of poverty and destitution than we typically encounter in our societies today. So in particular, hunger and starvation were serious concerns. And you get that sense as you read Down and Out in Paris and London. There's so much discussion of food and trying to find food and trying to subsist on, bread scraps or things that they've pulled out of the trash or things that they've, stolen from the restaurant or the kitchen in which they worked. So hunger was a serious issue. Health problems were also endemic. So no equivalent of kind of universal health care existed, no equivalent of disability insurance, and people were not well, right? They didn't have a lot of food, they didn't have a very comfortable lifestyle, dentistry, right? Those sorts of things, access to basic care, and people were living unhealthy lives. As a result, the class of people with which Orwell has surrounded himself are dirty, unhealthy, and just constantly, hungry. These individuals were forced to survive through begging or, meager forms of social assistance that existed through charities. And often these were affiliated with faith-based organizations, churches, right? So individuals, who couldn't provide for themselves, they could, get a free meal, but it might include listening to a sermon or, being proselytized to. So there were some forms of, charitable protections that were in place, but it was not provided by the state. It was usually provided by churches or faith-linked organizations. So just an important thing to keep in mind, poverty and destitution at this time, they're more extreme than we typically encounter today, and that is largely because of the absence of the social safety net. The third point is that the populations that Orwell went to live amongst were vilified, right? And that's one of the things that he takes on in this book is the stereotypical conceptions of the poor or beggars and what they represent and what kind of characters they are. So these individuals were thought that the folks that were living on the street were thought to be dangerous and criminal and depraved and diseased. And so Orwell was doing something that would have been viewed in his time to be extraordinarily dangerous. I think it still would be today if you were going to, live among the poorest of the poor, people who lack adequate housing, or you were to go and live on the street. That would be viewed as something dangerous. But particularly in Orwell's time, this was viewed as dangerous. So Orwell's engaged in something novel, and he's engaged in something risky, and he's trying to confront head-on some of the discourse about these individuals, why they end up in the conditions they're in, and what their lives are like, and what their character is like. And here we see just a heartbreaking scene, right, of children living on the street. That's another important point I should mention, is that while today we have in place protections like assistance for needy families and food stamps, and a lot of that is geared towards parents and families, not necessarily the same set of conditions in the 1930s. You did have children who simply were not attending school. You did have children who were begging and did not have access to really any sort of adequate nutrition, which is particularly terrible for folks that are at a young age. It's when your mind is forming and your body is forming, and if you don't have access to adequate nutrition, it's kind of sets you up for a life full of health problems. So that's the reality that Orwell is encountering. That's the cheery reality that he's decided that he's going to take on and attempt to document in this novel. Let's talk a little bit about his motivations and his method. So writing this book, if the mythology around poverty was to be believed, for Orwell, it would be dangerous. It would be dirty, and that, is the reality of his situation. If he's going to live on the street, he's going to live in rooming houses with people that are at the very, very bottom rung of the social ladder. He's going to encounter dirty people who don't smell so great and aren't the most, refined individuals. And he writes about that a lot. A lot of people zero in on that with Orwell, is that, he must have found poverty so repugnant. He talks about the smell a lot. And yeah, he does, because it's a relevant detail, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that he found the poor to be repulsive, but if you're going to write honestly about extreme poverty, yeah, human bodies sometimes stink when you don't wash them, right? So what were his motivations to engage in something that's probably going to be a little bit unpleasant? Well, we mentioned last time that Orwell's experience with imperialism had really impacted him deeply. So he returned from Burma, and he wanted to get inside the skin of the oppressed, right? That was one of his takeaway insights for this 5-year period of living in Burma and being a member of the Imperial Police Force, is that he wanted to, he had a sense that oppression was, something that ought to be resisted. And he said he came away from it with this feeling that the oppressed were always right and the oppressor was always wrong. And the problem is that now he's not in Burmese society anymore. He's in European society. And so he looks around his own society for a form of oppression that would be as acute as the colonial hierarchy that he had encountered in Burma. And he realized that the clearest parallel for him was the underclass. It was these individuals living in poverty. They were the, quote, subhuman creatures of his society. And they were treated, he felt, in the same way that, rural Burmese peasants had been treated in Burma. So that's, one of his motivations for being so interested in and wanting to write about the underclass, the poorer individuals in Europe. The second motivator for Orwell is that he's beginning to run in circles with kind of left-wing intellectuals. These would be, liberals, kind of progressive. Many of them avowed Marxists and socialists. So they're critical of the capitalist system. They're reading Marx and followers of Marx, and they're talking about how European societies oppress the worker and how we should adopt either political means or revolutionary means, resistance and violence, as a means to address the plight of workers and the working class and those that are in poverty. So these are individuals that are looking to fundamentally overhaul the capitalist system, and Orwell is in their circles and interacting with them, and he had always sort of doubted their authenticity. He thinks that these folks who talk about the capitalist system and how the workers' condition is so terrible and we need to do more to support them, he thinks that they don't really understand the working class, and he thinks that if you're going to speak on behalf of a group, you really need to understand them. And for Orwell, the way that you understand someone is by living among them, right? Trying to understand, trying to kind of occupy their space and understand their lives through being a part of it. So that's kind of the second thing. The third thing is that Orwell has a sense that the rhetoric about the dangers of these impoverished individuals is kind of overblown. He's been among them. He doesn't feel threatened by them. He's curious, right? And so he wants to know more. And he wants to see if this rhetoric about the poor, that they're criminal and dangerous and unhinged, and he wants to see if it's accurate. And if it's not accurate, then he wants to debunk it. So he has a variety of different motivations. He has a variety of different things driving him to kind of undertake this project. Incidentally, too, this picture is towards the close of Down and Out in Paris and London. Orwell is talking about the variety of different options that are available to someone who doesn't have a home, doesn't have a place that they live in, and there are numerous different options. Some of them more desirable, some of them less desirable. The best option would be for some sort of lodging house where you can rent a room by the night, and that was often where Orwell would stay. But sometimes you don't have enough money to do that. Sometimes there isn't space available. So there are other options, and one of them, which Orwell mentions, is that there was basically a series of benches in London, and people could sleep overnight on these benches. You had to pay for it, but it wasn't very much. And you could sleep overnight on these benches. They put up a rope that you could rest your head on, and I think it was 6 a.m. It was very early in the morning when they didn't want the people who had stayed out overnight on these benches anymore. They would just cut the rope. So that was how you would wake up, is after a few hours of sleeping on a bench in a sitting position with folks right up against you on either side. They would cut this rope and you would kind of fall forward. Gives you a sense of kind of how much compassion there was at this point to the urban poor in London. But I was just amazed to find a picture of this and to find out that this was a thing that actually existed. So a variety of motivations there that push Orwell to go and examine the underclass. What is his method? Well, as I said, Orwell puts a premium on face-to-face interaction. He thinks that whatever issue or group of people you're going to try and understand, you should be examining that face-to-face. You should look it in the eye, quite literally. So Orwell undertakes basically, he decides to live amongst the poor. There's a great quote by Marjorie Sabin. She wrote about Orwell and his writing in the 1930s, And she says that Orwell does not wish merely to enumerate evils and injustices, but to break through what he regards as middle-class oblivion, a state of false consciousness that in his representation of it amounts to a kind of lying. Orwell's corrective to such falsity comes first by immersion of his own body, a supreme measure of truth for Orwell directly into the experience of misery. Right? So Orwell thinks that yes, there are evils and injustices in the world, and yes, we have an obligation not to live in our middle-class oblivion, right? So not to be oblivious to the evils and injustices that exist, but also, if we're going to truly understand them, we have to immerse our body in them, right? We have to delve down directly into the experience of misery. So he undergoes kind of a cultural immersion in this book. That process of trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, trying to occupy, someone else's experience and think about what that might be like. We have a word for that today. It took time to come into fashion, and it took time for us to have a word that everybody knew that we used to describe that. But that word is empathy, right? And actually, while I was doing research for this class and getting things ready for this class, I just happened to come across an article about the role of empathy in journalism and nonfiction writing. It was a long-form article by a guy named Bill Marvel, who's a journalist. And I read it, and I thought it related so well to what Orwell is talking about that I reproduced this quote for you. So I'll just read the quote and talk about it a little bit. Marvel says that empathy requires that we approach our subjects from the inside. We try to enter into the emotions, thoughts, the very lives of those we write about. We try to imagine what it must be like to be them. Only by living in their skin, at least briefly, by walking in their shoes, can we begin to see that person as who he or she is. This requires moral imagination. It is what the good fiction writer does, and it is, I argue, what we writers of nonfiction must do. And the reason he's making an argument there, right, the reason that he's arguing this is because this is a controversial idea, especially among journalists, among those who write nonfiction. The idea that we try to empathize with our subjects. Some say, no, you can't do that. You'll be duped by people who want to lie to you. And so you'll end up presenting a misrepresentation of the facts. You'll end up presenting the narrative that they want you to tell, right? And some say that this is impossible. Some say that, true empathy doesn't really exist. You can't do it. You can never truly know what it's like to be someone else, or what it's like to, experience life as someone else experiences it. Orwell, I think, would probably be a little bit closer to Marvel in his assessment of the role of the writer, the role of the journalist. He tried to do this. He tried to imagine what it must be like to be any of the subjects he wrote about, right? To be a Burmese colonial subject, or to be, a impoverished person living in 1930s Paris or London. So he tried to do that. He does at various points, not so much in this book, but you'll certainly encounter it in The Road to Wigan Pier. He admits that it's really hard and potentially impossible to step outside one's class, to step outside one's, you're brought up with a certain set of customs and social norms and expectations associated with our socioeconomic class. It's really hard to break out of that. But Orwell thought we should try to do that, right? That's a responsibility that we have if we're going to tell a story. If Orwell was an academic and not a journalist or writer, we might call his method ethnography, right? Ethnography refers to the study of social groups and an attempt to learn about their practices and systems of meaning through the eyes of those social groups, right? And it's typically done through extensive field work. You collect data, but you do so living alongside the social groups that you're studying. And that's essentially what Orwell did. He lived in what we wouldn't hesitate to call slums. He stayed in these public rooming houses. He dressed shabbily. You're going to see that he survives by pawning his clothes. He engages in casual labor. He works in long hours in horrendous and dirty conditions as a dishwasher in a Paris hotel. And at times, he has virtually no money. He goes days without eating. In fact, there's one period in the book in which he has no work, so he has no source of income, and he has virtually no money. He's paid his rent for a few weeks at this rooming house, but he doesn't have any money for food. He doesn't have any money for tea or tobacco or any of the things that provide us with energy. And so, because he doesn't have any food, he has no energy, and so he can't even leave bed. Right? All he has is a bed, and his rent is paid, but he can't afford anything else. So if he was an academic, we might call that ethnography. That's kind of an extreme form of ethnography, but we might call it that. Orwell probably would not call it that. As I mentioned earlier, he tended to recoil at anything that sounded too overly intellectual or academic. You see in his writing, he's very plain-spoken. He was always kind of distrustful of intellectuals. And in this book, and in The Road to Wigan Pier, he does raise some questions about the extent to which we can truly immerse ourselves in class settings that are not our own. And that's a really interesting narrative in Down and Out in Paris and London, too, is these constantly in danger of being found out. Right? He's trying to blend in with tramps and people living on the street, but he knows that that's not his upbringing, and it probably doesn't come across as genuine. There is one instance in which he's at some sort of kind of charity rooming house where they provide people with a bed and a meal and a shower, and the guard there recognizes that he doesn't belong there, that he clearly comes from a middle-class background and has an education, and so we get to see how Orwell navigates that situation. So nevertheless, Orwell's method, it gives us a picture of this life and the practices of those who lived it, right? And we can understand a little bit better what this condition of extreme poverty would be like, what the experience would be like. So why then is this book important? Why is it important to understanding Orwell? How does it relate to 20th century political life? Well, let's start with understanding Orwell. We see here that he's turning his attention to something new, right? He's had kind of the Burmese imperial experience. His position and his views on imperialism have solidified, and they're never going to change. He will always view imperialism as some sort of terrible evil. But now he's turning his attention to poverty, to inequality, to economic class. And that's really something that is going to shape and inform his work for the rest of his life. He was fascinated by the poor. Some have even claimed that he thought that the poor, in many respects, were a superior class of human beings to the middle class or the upper classes. He thought they had this raw kind of human power. They had a resourcefulness, an ability to survive with very few resources, and a sense of solidarity, right? A sense of kind of togetherness and being part of a unified group that you didn't see among the other classes. So he's really fascinated with them. He's curious, and he admires them on some level. This experience is also going to be a formative one for shaping Orwell's own political views. He has really serious concerns about the poor and the working class and the way that they're treated. And so it draws him to socialism politically. It draws him to an ideology and a belief system that centers around economic class, right, and protecting the more vulnerable, the less well-off classes. So he ends up there, and by 1935 he's saying openly that he's a socialist. But he is always, throughout his work, going to be skeptical of those who purport to be socialist but don't know or understand the experience of poverty firsthand. So he's gaining that experience that he thinks gives him credibility in terms of his political views. Lastly, it shapes his views in ways that we'll see in later works. Certainly in The Road to Whig and Pure, which he wrote shortly after Down and Out in Paris and London was published. But even in later works, Homage to Catalonia, right, you're going to see these ideas resurface. And even works that he wrote in the 1940s, so 10, 15 years later, Animal Farm in 1984, are shaped by experiences he has looking at the least well-off in society in the late 1920s. So it'll help you better understand some of the works that we read later in the course or that you've already read. Why is this book important to understanding 20th century political life? That's a little bit more complicated. So the 20th century is a period in which we confronted a lot of different problems and challenges. War, fascism, colonialism, the creation and spread of atomic weapons, the Cold War, a variety of different things. But one of the major challenges of the 20th century is how to deal with poverty and inequality. So the 1900s of the 20th century saw capitalist economic systems becoming the dominant mode of organizing our societies. And so, we became accustomed to certain things, consumerism, markets, those sorts of things that are part and parcel of capitalist economic systems. But one of the things we've also experienced, and you've experienced it in your own life, is that capitalism can be unpredictable and it can be volatile. And it, by definition, creates winners and losers. It, by definition, creates inequality. It uses inequality as an incentive, right? We work hard because we want to gain more and have more than someone else. So, it's an engine that drives, in theory, drives growth and innovation. But it produces some negative side effects. Because you have winners and losers, because you have inequality, it means that there are going to be people that have a lot and acquire a lot, and another group of people that have very little and are suffering right at the margins of existence. So in the 1930s and 1940s, we began to realize if capitalism is unpredictable enough, and if the economic divisions that it creates are wide enough, then societies can begin to break down. So the rise of fascism in the 1930s would not have been possible if societies were not experiencing desperate times economically. And in our own time, we can think about, the financial crisis in 2008, and then the recession, which happens as a result of the financial crisis, but then lingers on, and in many ways we're still in it today. It's been a long and slow trudge out of the recession, and the inequality is still rampant, right? So in the aggregate, the advanced economies are growing and making money and recovering, but the gap between the rich and the poor is still very wide, and the recovery for the poorest of the poor it's not exactly sunshine and roses, right? So we've experienced this, and as people have faced these hard times economically, politics has become nastier, it's become more divisive, it's become more partisan, it's harder to get things done, it's harder to see Democrats and Republicans cooperating with one another, and the fringe, right, the political fringe, so the extremes of either side really have sprung up in full force, right, on both the political left and the political right. And that's no accident, right? When we have economic hard times, people are drawn towards extreme positions, and they're drawn towards positions that oftentimes are simplistic, and they vilify someone. You want to blame someone when something bad happens to you, and that's true today, and it was true in the 1930s. So, um, so Orwell is writing about class, he's writing about poverty, he's writing about inequality at a time when we're beginning to grasp what a powerful political effect these economic conditions can have. And he's trying to understand the lives of the poor and what poverty is actually like at a time when many in society would rather not think about such issues. And that, in a way, drove a lot of the rhetoric that we encountered about the poor at this time. I'll read you just a brief excerpt. It's in some of the best observations that Orwell makes are kind of towards the end of the book as he's thinking big picture about what he's learned. And this is chapter 36. He's talking about, you know, tramps, right? He's talking about people that live on the street and what we think of them versus the reality that he's encountered. So I'll just read a brief excerpt here. This is right. It's the very first paragraph of chapter 36. He says, in childhood, we've been taught that tramps are blackguards, and consequently there exists in our minds a sort of ideal or typical tramp, a repulsive, rather dangerous creature who would die rather than work or wash, and wants nothing but to beg and drink and rob hen houses. This tramp monster is no truer to life than the sinister Chinaman of the magazine stories, but he's very hard to get rid of. He goes on to say, the English are a conscience-ridden race with a strong sense of the sinfulness of poverty. One cannot imagine the average Englishman deliberately turning parasite, and this national character does not necessarily change because a man is thrown out of work. Indeed, if one remembers that a tramp is only an Englishman out of work, forced by law to live as a vagabond, then the tramp monster vanishes. I'm not saying, of course, that most tramps are ideal characters. I'm only saying that they are ordinary human beings, and if they are worse than other people, it is the result and not the cause of their way of life. When one has realized that, one begins to put oneself in a tramp's place and understand what his life is like. So Orwell is saying there that it's a precondition to even imagining what the experience of poverty is like, to dispel these notions we have that the poor are this monstrous class of people. The tramp monster, he says, is a fiction. It doesn't exist. And he said if they're worse than ordinary human beings, then that is because it's a result, not a cause of their life. So it's not that they were, born with some predisposition to steal or to engage in certain forms of behavior, to not fit within respectable society. It's because they've lived this terrible, terrible life for so long that it's pushed them to that position. It's an effect. It's not a cause, which I think most of us would accept today, that people who are impoverished, that's a product of unfortunate circumstances, and so then other things emerge out of that. Substance abuse emerges out of that. Not being able to hold a job maybe emerges out of that. Those sorts of characteristics. But at the time, what Orwell was contending with was this mythology of the poor, and you didn't necessarily want to interact with them. You didn't want to go and try to understand what their lives are truly like. And so what he's doing, in a way, is kind of courageous. So in that sense, reading a work like Down and Out in Paris and London can demythologize the experience of poverty, and it perhaps gives us a sense of what the lives of the poor are truly like. I say most of us, most of us kind of college-educated folks can look at poverty and recognize that it's a structural and systemic condition, and it's not a failure of character most of the time. But we still encounter this kind of mythology of poverty, right? If you look at contemporary debates about welfare policy or what to do about the poor, there's a lot of vilification of the poor and not a lot of big picture discussion of, okay, why are so many people poor? Why are so many people utilizing government welfare programs? Why are so many people on food stamps? Why are so many people receiving social assistance? So that's useful. It's useful to kind of think about things, and Orwell depicts, real desperate poverty to us in a way that that I think makes us cognizant of some of the underlying causes and the fact that we're dealing with human beings, and so we should try to understand what their experience is like. So we might use his reportage to think about what our responsibilities to such individuals are and how we can use public policy to make their lives a little bit desperate, a little bit less desperate, sorry. That's, I think, all I'll say about why this is important, and I think that the book itself is there's a lot to potentially discuss there, and I think we can go a lot of different directions with it. I'd be interested to see what in particular you guys gravitated towards, or what you think is relevant to contemporary discussions that we're having today, either in the state of Maine or in the United States as a whole. But that gives you kind of a basic snapshot of the context in which the book resides. And we spend 1 week with Down and Out in Paris and London. There are reading questions to think about for this specific reading assignment available on Blackboard. So I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to discussing the text with you guys once you get a chance to read it. Thanks.